All right. Well, welcome to what is it, lecture 103 now, I think, or 104, one of those of Rambam Mor Nevuchim. For those that watch this, the book that I'm using and page numbers are in the Shlomo Penis edition of the second volume. We are in part 3, chapter 19. So, and the Rambam's in the middle of discussing the issue of providence, right? Providence is the idea that basically that God is involved in everything that happens in this world. So it presupposes the fact that he knows everything that's happening. And therefore, if you walk outside and you get bopped in the head by a branch or something, you would say to yourself, that was a message from God. God did that, so on and so forth. So that's the idea of providence. So he started, we studied for in the last couple chapters. The Rambam developed, he gave us various different views of what providence is and what it means. And then he established his own view, which he says is the Torah's view of providence. And the thing that we worked on last week, chapter 18, was Rambam laid out the idea that there is no specific providence over everything, all the animals and plants in the world. What happens is God created the world, made it in such a way that every animal and every plant and every creature and every rock and every has its properties, has its things, has what it needs, has what it doesn't need, and they go along their way according to the laws which God laid down. But then he said, as far as human beings go, Rambam explained that providence is consequent on our intellect, right? In other words, to the extent that we exercise the active intellect, right, that makes us different from the active intellect was when we talked a bunch about Rambam's what I called his construct, his psychological construct, construct of the human psyche and brain, with the active intellect, which receives its intelligence and its special wisdom through emanations going all the way up, through the spheres all the way up to God himself. And that gives us the ability to analyze the situation, understand the situation, study what's happening, and then make a decision to do the right thing, right? To the extent that we use that intellect and that wisdom in the way we live and the way we make our decisions, that is exercising God's providence, right? In that sense, we can choose to do anything, A or B, good or bad. To the extent that we allow ourselves to be ruled by the other part of our brain, what he calls the imaginary our imaginary disposition, that which we sense the world around us, that to the extent that we are ruled by that, which is also represented by our chomer, by the form with what we're made of, the flesh and blood, that's not providence. That's just following the laws of nature. We're just as good as the animals if that's the way we live our lives. So exercising our choice, right, becomes God's providence, right? And that's it was a fascinating idea, and that's what he explained in chapter 18. But he has a lot more to say. So let's look at chapter 19. I started chapter 19 last time, but I think I want to start it again because it's kind of a whole idea. So I apologize if I repeat a little bit. But remember, providence presupposes knowledge, right? God has to, in order to intervene in this world, he has to know what's happening in this world, right? So the Rambam told us that many people have decided that it must be that God doesn't know, right? Rambam insists that God does know everything, right? So now if he does know, then you're stuck with the what I'm going to give a tiny summary of what he was about to say in chapter 19, and that is that people were led to contradict what the Torah teaches about God's knowledge because of a big problem. Because if you assume that God knows everything, right, then you can't make sense of that which we see. Because if God knows everything, then how could it be that he doesn't know that I'm an innocent guy and God forbid I get punished with some kind of punishment, or that person, that child who didn't do anything wrong is suffering from a genetic disease, right? If God knows, right, you have to then explain why. You have to explain why if you're a good person and you go and a drunk driver comes down the streets and hits you, God forbid, you have to explain that. So they concluded by saying that God must not know, right? So the Rambam was going to bring that point. Chapter 19, no doubt it is a primary notion that all good things, and the assumption is that the definition of good, right, in Maimonidean philosophy is that things are the way they're supposed to be. That's the definition of good. So the creator who made everything, right? If not for him, there wouldn't be anything, right? It clearly is good, right? Because whatever he did, that's exactly how it's supposed to be. So it's by its very definition good. So if it's good, so then it's a primary notion that ignorance with regard to anything must be a deficiency, right? And we also assume that if I don't know something, that's something that's missing from me, right? I might know a lot about the field of medicine that I practice, but I don't know that much about neurology. That information about neurologic disorder, I don't know, Parkinson's disease, that's a deficiency in me. I don't know about it. And if you ask me a question about it, I wouldn't know. I learn about it, then I fill that deficiency. And there can't be a deficiency in God. So God must know everything, right? So, but however, so if that's true, then why do some people of speculation, why do some people who are otherwise intelligent have the temerity to say that he knows this but not that, right? The reason why is because what they imagined as to the lack of order in the circumstances of the human individuals. They imagined that things aren't the way they're supposed to be, right? So, and then he points out, yet most of these circumstances are not merely natural. The circumstances about which the things that are, which don't seem to be the way they're supposed to be, are often consequent, but also most of these circumstances, right, are also consequent upon the fact that man is endowed with the ability to act and with reflection, right? Of course, there are things that aren't the way they're supposed to be, but most of the time that's because of something that a human being decided to do, right? If someone gets drunk and hits someone else's car, right, that person decided to drink and decided to get into his car and drive drunk, right? So you can't then ask a question about this is not something that came to be that was supposed to be that way. This came to be because someone decided to do something that made it happen that way. The prophets have already mentioned that the ignorant infer that the deity has no knowledge of our actions merely from the fact that they see wicked people living in prosperity and abundance. Often you see a person who's an evil person, but he's living high on the fly, right? For this impels the excellent man to think. So a person will think, if I was, so now I'm the one who behaved myself. I played by all the rules. I paid all my taxes. That cheater there, he didn't do anything right. And he's driving around in a Maserati and has a 10-bedroom mansion, right? So then I think, what was the point, right? To think, why did I do good things? It compels me to think that my inclination towards good and the hardships due to the opposition of others that he endures because of that are useless. It was all a waste. Why did I bother being good if I didn't get anything, right? So which makes an assumption that the purpose of doing good is in order to get that Maserati and the 10-bedroom mansion, right? You're making an assumption which isn't true, right? But thereupon the prophet has mentioned that he had let his thought wander freely with regard to this subject until it had become clear to him that things should be considered as they are in their final outcome and not in their beginnings. The first answer, the first sliver of an answer that Rambam is giving to this question is you can't look at just the thing that you see in front of you. You have to be able to see it in the big picture, right? And remember, this is not the whole answer, but it's a very important part of the answer, right? When all I see is that I walked out the door and I got slammed in the head by a tree, right? All I see is a bump on my head and it hurts, right? But the big picture, which is why are there trees? Why is there wind? Why do trees die, right? Overall, the rules of nature that led to that tree being where it is. Why did I build a house, right? Why should I watch the weather chat to know if there's going to be a storm and maybe not go outside when there's a tree, right? What do I learn from that? Why is it that I should look around in my yard and see that that tree's branches are falling? Maybe I should take care of it before it lands on somebody's head, right? So you have to, as you go out of the big picture, all of a sudden, right? It doesn't become a punishment that I didn't deserve, but it becomes something that I should have been prepared for, I should have watched out for, I should have taken care of, and I should learn something from. There's something good about trees. We like trees. We need trees. We need the weather. We need the wind. We need the rain. So all the big picture, all of a sudden things start to make more sense. Obviously, as the pictures get wider and wider and you have God's view, then you look at everything and everything makes sense. But we don't see that, right? So he brings from Tehillim, from Psalms, the following Tehillim, and we read through this last time, but I'm going to read it again. I just want it to be whole, and I apologize for being repetitive, but we'll do it again. So this is Tehillim 73, Psalm 73. So it's starting from verse 11. So it says, "V'amru," these people, Eicha yoda el v'yesh deya be'elyon. How could it be that God knows, right? Look at Hine Eli Risham, these are evil people, v'shal v'olam hisku chayil, and they're living at the top of the world, and they get all this wealth, right? Ach rik zikisi livavi. So for nothing, I lived my life as a pure person. I washed my hands with clean water, and I did everything right. So it was for nothing. Look at them. Look at what they have. And me, what all day I'm afflicted, and every day I get another punishment. So but if I would speak like this, I would have been rebelling against the people that stay with you, God, your club, right? So these same thoughts are mentioned, and I'm turning the page to 478 in Malachi. And if I think this is where I was up to last time, was up to Malachi, right? So in the prophet Malachi, chapter 3, we'll start from verse 13, we have the similar thoughts. It says, you have spoken hard words, Amar Hashem, says God. And you said, what have we been saying among ourselves against you? You said it's not worth it to serve God. What profit is there? If we keep the things that he wants us to keep, and that we walk with awe in front of God. Now we look at the Zaydim, the arrogant people, the false people, the evil people. They're the ones that are wealthy. Gam nivnu osei risha, right? The people who do evil are prosper. They are built up. They have tested out God. They said, "Ha, God, I'm not going to listen to you." And see, and they got away with it, right? So so it's the same observation. So us nidbru yirei Adonai Yisrael. These are the kinds of things that the people that do fear God tell each other, and they're concerned about, and they ask each other, "What's this about?" So vayakshev Adonai vayishma, and God listened, and He heard. Vayikasev, and He wrote Sefer Zikaron, a book of remembrance, lefanav liyirei Adonai, for those that fear God, l'choshvei shmo, those that think of God's name. So over here, I just read from Malachi. So David too has made clear that the opinion was well known in his time and has made clear its necessary consequences, namely the wrongdoing and unjust treatment of men by one another. Most of this, what's happening here, Rambam is reminding us, is happening between one person and another, between people and other people. He began to argue with a view to destroying that opinion and to making it known that he, may be exalted, knows all this. God knows what we're doing to each other. God knows the evil that we're doing to each other. But He made the world work the way it works for a reason which is well above that punch that the guy did, or that drunk person that hit another person with his car. And then he ends that piece of Tehillim that we said before, the same kapitel, this is it's not the same one. It's right next to it. It's hold on one second. It's Tehillim 94, right? It's a different one. I'm sorry, it's not the same one. I apologize. Verse 6, where he answers that question, and he says, "Almana v'ger yaharogu." They kill the poor, the stranger, the migrant, and the widow. And they murder the orphans. And they say the Lord doesn't see it, and God does not understand. Binu ba'arim ba'am. Listen, understand, think about this, those of you who are brutish among the people. Uchsilim, and you fools. Masai taskilu, when will you get wisdom? Hanota ozon ishma. God who created the ear, doesn't He hear? Im yotzer ayin, He created the eye, halo yabit, doesn't He look? Hayoser goyim alo yechiach, the one who punishes nations, doesn't He give rebuke? Hamalamed adam das, the one who teaches human beings knowledge. Adonai yodea machshavos adam. God knows the thoughts of people, because they are not there, nothing. And then And then it continues. So one of the so now what Rambam is going to talk about now is he's bringing this in order to address this question of the nature of God's knowledge, right? King David in the Psalms just told us that God created the eye, so obviously he sees, right? So what does that mean? What is David trying to tell us when he says this? So some people make a mistake, and I'm about to start the second paragraph from 478. I shall explain to you the meaning of this argument after I have mentioned to you the way in which those who are over hasty in their interpretations of the prophet's discourse misunderstand this discourse, right? And they misunderstand it by saying, well, I see, right? God created the eye, and David said, so it must be God sees, right? So they immediately assume that God sees just like you and I see. Now, you and I see there's this actual sense called sight, and scientifically we can describe what happens when that sense happens. But there's a lot more to it, right? And that is that I see the things that I'm looking at. If you ever watch a magician, right, he can pull off all kinds of crazy tricks, right? And a lot of it is what they call I forget what it's called, but it's sleight of hand in such a way that they make you focus on looking at what they're doing here, but the actual trick is going on somewhere else, but you're not looking there because they draw your attention to one place. So, and it's something that we can't help ourselves. And magicians will exploit that human trait and show you a magic trick. But if we actually looked at the bigger picture, we'd understand that it's not a trick, that it's not magic, right? So we'd understand what he's doing. So when we see things that we want to see, we see things that we're focused at, and we can only see what's in our range of sight, right? So everything about if you say that God sees, right? If that's your assumption from this verse, then you subconsciously and consciously are making assumptions about God's sight that are not relevant to God's sight. Okay, so several years ago, some distinguished individuals of our religious community who were physicians, so he's trying to say that they were educated, right, told me that they wondered at this dictum of David. He said, according to his way of reasoning, it would follow necessarily that God eats and God's lungs make shouts, and the same would hold for all the other members. And God does everything that the human does because he created them. So what's David saying? Reflect now, those who have studied this treatise of mine, how far they were from a correct understanding of this argument. And here it's true meaning. Those of you that have been learning more Nevuchim until now, Rambam says with his book with me, know that clearly David doesn't mean that God sees, right? That God has a sense of sight, like we have a sense of sight because he created eyes. What it means is in case of anyone who makes an instrument, if I were to go and make an instrument, if I would, if I have no concept, if he has no, it is clear that unless he has a conception of the work to be done, I'd be unable to make it, right? If I had no idea what a knife's function was, and you gave me a piece of metal and a handle and told me to make a knife, I could never make a knife. And if I would, it certainly wouldn't be a very good knife because I wouldn't know how it's used. Where would I put the handle? Where do I do it? Where's the, I wouldn't know, right? So for instance, unless a smith has a conception and an understanding of the meaning of sewing, right, he would not make a needle in that form, which alone permits performing an act of sewing. Like those days, if you wanted to get a sewing needle, you go to a blacksmith and he makes you a needle. Now, the blacksmith is not a sewer, or is not a tailor, right? But the blacksmith has to understand what tailors do in order to make a needle for the tailor to use it, right? The same applies to the other instruments. When therefore some of the philosophers thought that God does not apprehend these individual things because they are apprehended by the senses, remember, Rambam brought this argument in the last chapter, that some philosopher says that God can't know things, right? Because the things that we are down here are physical things. God is not a physical being, so he can't comprehend these things. That was an argument that some philosophers made. He can't have knowledge of that stuff. And that was one of their answers to their question of providence. He doesn't know what's going on because he's spiritual and we're physical. He doesn't know. But that's not a good argument, right? Why? Because he does not apprehend with a sense. God is apprehending through an intellectual apprehension, right? Which Rambam already explained this many times, that intellect is not the same as our intellect either, right? But it's some sort of intellectual apprehension. We're using the word intellect because we don't have a better word to describe it, right? So David, he argued against them by starting from the existence of the senses, saying there is such a thing as sight. So whoever created that thing called sight must have known and understood what it is that sight does, right? So you can't claim. So of course God knows and understands what people are doing to each other and how we're treating each other and how we make each other hurt and suffer all the time, right? Because his apprehension, he created all of the things about us that make us do these things and why we act the way we act, right? If the meaning of the apprehension in the sense of sight is hidden from him and he does not know it, how did he bring into existence this instrument, which is disposed for a visual apprehension? Do you hold that it could have happened by chance? That a certain clear humor, that's the fluid in the eye, should be produced, and outside it a similar humor, another fluid, and then a certain membrane, and a hole within the membrane, and in front of that hole, another clear and hard membrane. He apparently had either dissected an eye when he learned to medical school, or was taught by someone who dissected an eye, right? So it didn't just happen. God designed the eye because he wanted it something that should see, right? So he obviously knows and understands sight. And the same thing for every part of our bodies and everything about us and every existence in the world. If he created it, he knew and understood how it worked, what its purpose is, and so on. To sum up, can someone endowed with intelligence conceive that the humors, membranes, and nerves of the eye, which as is known are so well arranged, and all of which have as their purpose the final end, this act of seeing, have come about fortuitously? Certainly not. But as every physician and every philosopher has set forth, this is brought about of necessity through a purpose of nature. Now, according to the general consensus of philosophers, nature is not endowed with an intellect and a capacity for governance. And here's where it's interesting. Rambam is saying it comes about because of a law of nature. The laws of nature are not intellectual. They're not a thought process. They're not an angel thinking of things. They are the laws of nature by which those laws, this eye came about. Now, this would be a very good way of understanding. Many people have argued, and we touched on this a few times. Rambam's science was obviously very different than ours, and obviously he had no concept of what we now call the theory of evolution and how an eye might have developed, right? But the Rambam right here is stating the laws of nature brought this eye to be the way it is. In the same way that it would not be difficult for the Rambam to fast forward 1,000 years and say the same thing. The laws of biology that made this develop this way caused that it should be this way, right? Now, according to so rather does this craftsman-like governance proceed, according to the opinion of philosophers, from an intellectual principle. And according to us, so they say that it comes because of a principle, a law of nature that made it that way. We say, according to us, it's the act of an intelligent being who impressed all the faculties in question into all the things in which a natural faculty exists. God created the world in this way, and he set the rules of nature in place to work the way they work. So that's the difference between us and Aristotle, Rambam says. If, however, that intellect does not apprehend or know the matter in question, how, according to that opinion, can he have brought into existence? Or how can there have proceeded from him a nature tending toward a purpose of which he has no knowledge? So clearly, God knows that he created people with arms, with a hand that can become a fist. He created us with anger and resentment and jealousy. And he created our ability to make a decision to throw that fist into someone else's nose, right? So if somebody does that, of course, God knows what's happening. Of course, he knows. What exactly does it mean that he knows? It means that every single thing that went into that happening, God made it for that purpose in such a way. So of course he knows. So their idea that God doesn't know, that's what David was trying to contradict when he made that statement in Psalms. Accordingly, it is the truth that he called them brutish and fools. This is why he calls these people who think this way to be fools, right? You think that you're getting away with this, right? Because God doesn't care. God made everything, you, and every single thing about you. He knows it all. Don't think that there's, that it's okay to do it because God doesn't know. Thereupon he begins to make clear that this is deficiency in our apprehension. The first thing David criticizes is our foolishness, right? It's the foolishness of the people that talk that way, that God may be honored and magnified who has given us the intellect with which we apprehend. And because of our incapacity to apprehend his true reality, there arise in us these great doubts. The issue here is, though, right, we do have these doubts, we have these doubts because we can't understand God's full intellect, right? First of all, we don't have the full knowledge of every single thing that happened in history from beginning to end and will happen from beginning to end, and everything that's happening right now on the entire planet, in the entire universe, and every galaxy, and every so on and so forth. That's something that we don't see. But even beyond that, right? We can't apprehend God. Even if we did somehow have a giant computer data bank in our brain that knew everything, right? So therefore we have doubts. And this is our deficiency, right? It's a deficiency in us that we don't understand why that person is living in a big fancy house, even though he's an idiot, right? And why I am struggling and trying to be honest and do things right. Why I don't have, God forbid I suffer for whatever reason. We don't understand it because it's a lack in our knowledge, because we don't understand God's knowledge, but absolutely God knows, right? And that no attention should be directed to the rash reflections necessarily proceeding from this, our inadequate thought, right? Our reflections, our ideas is inadequate. We don't have that wisdom. We don't have that knowledge. So our conclusions that it's not the way things aren't the way they should be are simply from our lack of knowledge, which is why David criticized knowledge when he criticized those people. The whole of my aim in this chapter, why did I go off on this, right? I'm talking about providence, and why did I talk about this concept of God's knowledge being different from our knowledge, and talking about how, God obviously doesn't have a sense of sight and so on. The whole of my aim in this chapter was to make it clear. And we have to remember this paragraph as the summary of this entire chapter, which we studied tonight. That this speculation is very ancient. This idea that God doesn't know everything because things aren't the way they should be, right? Is a very old idea. I refer to the notion that God lacks apprehension. Don't think you're a genius philosopher if you come up with it on your own. People, and this is true. You talk to, sometimes, not God forbid to criticize kids, but you talk to a 16-year-old who thinks he's declared himself an atheist. He's sitting in Yeshiva. He said, what? I don't like this all. He declared himself to be an atheist because he's a genius. Why? Because it can't be that God knows everything, because why is it that this is suffering? And he thinks he's so smart that he came up with something that now I'm going to leave religion because, genius. People have been saying this for thousands and thousands of years. 1,000 years ago, the Rambam said it was ancient, right? Because King David talked about it more than 1,000 years before him. So the notion which has occurred to the ignorant in view of the fact that the circumstances of the human individuals by which their nature are contingent are not well ordered, right? People think, we see things that are unfair. We see, people beating up on other people. We see one country bullying another country, and they're not well ordered. That's this to conclude from that God doesn't know what's going on is just a stupid, immature conclusion, right? Literally brutish and foolish, right? So thus it says, and the children of Israel did impute things that were not right unto the Lord. And it says in Medrash, what did they say? They said that this column neither sees nor hears nor speaks. They wish to refer to this by their imagining that God does not apprehend these circumstances, that no command or prohibition from him reaches the prophets. So if God doesn't understand anything, then God doesn't talk to people. He doesn't teach us either, right? He doesn't tell us what we're supposed to do. And if he told the prophet that we're not supposed to, pick your commandment, right? It can't be that God ever said that. He doesn't know, he doesn't care, right? The cause of all this, and according to them, the proof of it are to be found in the fact that the circumstances of human individuals do not take a course that is in accordance with what, as one of us considers ought to happen, right? What we think should be, we don't see in the world when we look at it. And therefore, many people will then conclude, God doesn't exist, or maybe he exists, but he doesn't care, or he doesn't know, right? The Lord sees us not. Sophania says concerning those that say in their heart, the Lord will not do good, neither will he do evil. As for what should be said concerning his knowledge, may he be exalted of all things, I shall inform you of my opinion concerning this after I have made known to you the matters about which there is general consensus, and that no one endowed with intellect can contradict on any point. So I'm going to discuss now, Rambam says in the next chapter and beyond, what exactly is the nature of God's knowledge, right? He declared here that it's very different from ours. not just in quantity, but in quality, but both are important, right? And and um and that the prophets are teaching us that we have to look at the big picture, which we can't see. Only God can see, right? And that's and therein lies at least a major part of the answer to the question of theodicy. And it's arrogant of us to think that if things aren't the way we think they should be, then we go ahead and conclude that God must not know, right? So that's the end of 19. I'll open the floor for questions before we start 20. Or, questions, comments, issues, anything.
Just going to say, from your knowledge as a doctor, like, why are we conditioned like that to expect to know everything about everything? Like, it's not, it's something new, right? Like in the time of Rambam, most people didn't ask these questions, right? They just, this is how it is, and that's what we do, and that's it, right?
It's I don't know that that's true. Well, certainly some people were, because Rambam is talking about some of them. But I think that what we have here is I think it's arrogance. It may not be, in some cases we may not realize how arrogant it is. The assumption that we know how things are supposed to be, right? And that's really the bottom line of I think of all of the Torah is and what God wants from us. If we is to get off of our high pedestal. As human beings, all knowledge that we've truly achieved as human beings, but whether it's scientific knowledge or Torah knowledge, any kind of knowledge, has been achieved because if it's true, it's been achieved because of humility, right? Because we recognize that we had a lack of knowledge, we didn't know something, right? That takes humility. And when you recognize that you don't know something, then you can start honestly studying and you could actually find something out. But if you come to the classroom thinking you know it all already, then you're not going to listen to the lecture, right? Right? If you think, if you already think you understand all of science, you're never going to make a discovery, right? So any advancement in human knowledge has always come from a basis of humility, and the problem here is that the Rambam is basically telling us this. The conclusions that people make, against the Torah comes from arrogance. It comes from arrogance because you don't see what you think you should see. You think you know what's right, right? And therefore, when you don't see that, you start getting angry, and then you have to come up with an answer. So you say there is no God, or God doesn't care, or God doesn't know, right? But we don't know how it's supposed to be. We have no idea how it's supposed to be. How do I know what my life is supposed to be like? How am I supposed to know, right? I don't, I don't know. I don't know what's supposed to happen to me. How should there's no, I certainly don't know what's supposed to happen to you. Anyway, so yeah, I think the bottom line is arrogance. I don't know if I'll ever do this, but I want to. Some part of me wants to write a book that basically looks at the Rambam's Moreh Nevuchim as a book about humility. The point that I just made before is really the essence, and I think it underlies just about everything the Rambam says. But anyway, any other comments on 19 before we move on? All right. If there are none, then I'm going to hit 20. So remember, Rambam said he's going to he wants to his aim is to tell us about God's knowledge. But before he tells us about God's knowledge, he wants to give us a couple of philosophical pointers that no one endowed with an intellect can contradict in any point. So if you don't agree, that means you don't have an intellect. So a matter concerning with so he wants to lay out some general consensus philosophical issues. So general consensus is that it is not true that new knowledge should come to him, may be exalted, so that he would know now what he did not know before, right? Now, Rambam already explained to us in other places that the concept of time, doesn't exist in God's realm, right? Time itself is a creation, right? Because he told us that time is consequent upon motion, right? And there is no motion in God's world. He's not going anywhere. He's not in a place where he goes from point A to point B that we should measure how long it takes to go from point A to point B. So time doesn't exist there. However, let's just for the argument's sake, let's assume that there was such a thing as time. It can't be that at a certain point in time, God knows something that he didn't know before, because so that he would know. And it is not true, even according to the opinion of those who believe in the attributes, even those people who give attributes to God and describe him in certain ways. Remember, Rambam himself strongly rejected that notion. He said no attribute can be used to describe God. We can only describe what he's not. That's Rambam's very famous philosophical principle of. It's usually called his principle of negative attributes, right? So that he should have many and numerous insights. So they right who those, and he quoted a Muslim school of thought that does give attributes to God, right? And he say that he has many, and they also agree that he could not have known something now, right, that he didn't know before, right? After this has been demonstrated, once we accept that as a philosophical principle, we, the community of those who adhere to the Torah, right, say that he knows with one single knowledge the many and numerous things, right? So God doesn't have compartments. He doesn't like have one section where he remembers the scores of the baseball game and the other section where he remembers, which bridge you take to get to the Bronx, right? It's all one big knowledge. It's all, or one little knowledge. It's just one, right? So for as far as he himself is concerned, insights do not differ because of the difference of the things known, as is the case with respect to us. We categorize things by their differences. I remember the parking space. Where for me is here, the parking space for my boss is there, and we categorize things. That parking space is different because it's his and not mine, right? This is my house, this is my office, and we categorize it. This is where I sleep, this is where I work, and so on. But God doesn't have those differences. There aren't differences. He knows it's all just one big knowledge, right? Similarly, we say that he has known all the things that are produced anew before they have come about, and he has known them perpetually. Whatever is going to happen in the future, whatever happened in the past, God knows them, and knows them all at the same time, right? For this reason, no new knowledge comes to him in any way. For seeing that he knows that a certain man is now non-existent, but will exist at a certain time, will go on existing for such and such a duration, and will then again become non-existent, there will be for him no additional knowledge when that individual comes into existence as he had known beforehand. Right? God knows that Joe Smith is going to be born on December 1st, 1962. He's going to die on January 12th, 2029. And so when those dates come about, God didn't learn anything new, right? It just happened. Right? He knew it the whole time, right? Nothing was produced thereby that was unknown to him. On the contrary, something was produced of which it had been perpetually known, that it would be produced in the way it came into existence. Thus, it follows necessarily from this belief that knowledge may have as its object non-existent things and may embrace the infinite. So what this means then is that knowledge is, or at least God's knowledge, right, can be thinking about things that don't exist yet, right? And it can be thinking about infinite things because the existence of the world is infinite. It goes on forever. So, and this is indeed our belief, for we say that it is not impossible that his knowledge should have as its object the non-existent things about whose being brought into existence he knew beforehand, and that he is able to bring into existence. On the other hand, that which is never brought into existence is with reference to his knowledge an absolutely non-existent thing, right? Which is not an object for his knowledge, right? As that which is non-existent for us is not an object for our knowledge. So something that will never exist, never did exist, and could never exist. And I remember a couple of chapters ago, the Rambam said this, a very similar idea when he said that God can't do the impossible because by its very nature, if it's impossible, then it's not something that exists, right? So it's not something that he knows because it's just not something to be known, right? Okay. So as for knowledge of the infinite, there is a difficulty about it. So he's laying down these ideas so that when he starts telling us about, more details about God's knowledge, we have to have this background in order to understand what he's going to tell us. And remember, knowledge is key here because when God knows things, that's what starts off the question of theodicy, right? God knows things. And therefore we ask, well, if he knows, then why am I suffering if I'm innocent? Why is that evil person prospering? So as for knowledge of the infinite, there is difficulty about it. Some of the people of speculation came to profess the opinion that knowledge has for its object the species, but in a certain sense extends to all the individuals of the species, right? So God knows of we know, right, about cats. I'm saying that because my cat's running around right now. So we know generally about cats. We know what they look like. We know a little bit about what they act like, sound like, what kind of things they eat, so on and so forth, right? And I might know a little bit about certain cats. I know about my cat. I know about my friend's cat, right? This is the opinion of all those who adhere to a law in view of what is required by the necessities of speculation. The philosophers, however, right, um, affirm decidedly that his knowledge, God's knowledge, may not have for its object a non-existent thing, and that no knowledge may embrace that infinite. Consequently, as no new knowledge may come to him, it is impossible that he should know anything of the things that are produced anew. So what these philosophers say is that accordingly, he only knows the permanent, immutable things. God knows, and she heard that I'm talking about her. So God knows that there's cats, right? Because there's always going to be cats. There always was cats. Remember, in Aristotelian times, their physics assumed that the world is and was and always will be the same way that it is now, right? So they didn't have a concept of evolution like we have today. So God knows then that there's such a thing as cats. He knows what cats do. He knows so on and so forth. But he can't know, right, something that didn't happen yet, right? That a certain cat is going to be born 100 years from now. So and he certainly can't know things that are infinite. This is what these philosophers said, right? Even if he should know, right? Another doubt, however, arose in some of them, and they said even if he should know only the permanent things, he would have many insights. For if the things known become many, the insights regarding them become many. So let's say a cat has a lot of kittens. Now he knows about a lot of kittens, and one kitten that's cute and cuddly, and the other kitten that's mean, and the other one that likes to cuddle, the other one that likes to jump on the refrigerator, right? So for to everything known, there is the knowledge that is special for it. Consequently, he only knows his own essence. In the end, they by after speculating all of this and deciding what he can know and what he can't know, they ended up deciding that he really only knows about himself. Okay. So why do they have all these problems? What I myself say is that I'm at the third paragraph on page 481 now. All these difficulties to which all of them are subject have as their cause the fact that they established a relation between our knowledge and his. Why are they getting confused about all these things? The bottom line is they're confused about all these things and they come up with all these weird ideas. And if we didn't understand them, that's fine, because we don't need to understand exactly what all these philosophers are saying. But they were generated by the assumption that God's knowledge is like your and my knowledge, right? You and I think in terms of categories. We think in terms of differences. We think in terms of what happened first and what happens later. That's how the human mind is constructed, right? God's intelligence, his knowledge, is not anything at all like ours. It's a totally different thing. We can't even compare it at all, right? For every sect considers the thing, right, that are impossible for our knowledge, and consequently thinks that this also holds necessary with regard to his knowledge, or else that the thing is obscure for it, right? They assume that which you and I can know, you and I can't conceive of infinity. I mean, we could talk about it, but we can't conceive of something that's infinite. It's just not something that a human being can conceive of, right? We can't conceive of things that haven't happened yet because they haven't happened yet. How are we supposed to be thinking about it, right? But that's true about you and I. That's because our knowledge works a certain way, right? The philosophers ought to be blamed more strongly than anyone else with regard to this question. For they were those who have demonstrated that there is no multiplicity in this essence. They have proved, and he brought this earlier, Aristotle's proofs, for the fact that there is no multiplicity in God and why there can't be. We won't go into that now, but we did in the past, right? God is a complete unified essence, may be exalted, and that he has no attribute beyond his essence. He can't be described by any attribute. You can't say he's big, tall, dark, light. You can't describe God by giving attributes to him, right? He has no attribute behind it other beyond his own essence. But that, on the contrary, his knowledge is his essence, and his essence is his knowledge. Okay, as we have explained, there were those who have demonstrated that our intellects are incapable of apprehending the true reality of his essence as it really is. How then can they think that they can apprehend his knowledge? If we can't understand God's essence, and God's essence is the same thing as his knowledge, because there aren't two different things in God, there's just one, right? There aren't different stuff. There isn't, this is his essence. Like for us, we have a brain that's made up of neurons and gray matter and so whatever and so on and so forth, right? God doesn't have a brain, and then you describe, okay, what kind of knowledge can that brain compute, right? A computer, you have a hard drive, and what kind of bytes can it store and to come up with knowledge? It doesn't work that way. They're the same. There's only one thing, and the fact that we can't conceive, we don't know what I'm talking about, is the point, right? So how they can think that they can apprehend his knowledge, seeing that his knowledge is not a thing that is outside of his essence. For the self-same incapacity that prevents our intellects from apprehending his essence also prevents them from apprehending his knowledge of things as they are. So when we say that God knows things, we don't even know what we mean. We don't even know what we're saying. What does it mean, God? What does that mean, God knows? We have no idea what that is, right? For this knowledge is not of the same species as ours, so that we can draw an analogy with regard to it, but a totally different thing. That's Rambam's words, right? So, and just as there is necessarily existent essence from which, according to their opinion, every existent derives its necessity, or that according to our opinion, so in other words, just like the philosophers believe that there is an essence, which they would call the laws of nature, right? Or whatever the Aristotelian equivalent term would be, right? Some rule that makes it that things have to be the way they are. And according to our opinion, the rules that were established by the creator that made things the way they are produces all things that are other than itself after they have been non-existent. So God, there was nothing in existence, and God decided to make a world, create a world which works the way it is, right? Because that's what he decided to make it in the way he made it. So do we say that this essence apprehends all that is other than itself, that in all the things that exist, nothing whatever is hidden from it, and that between our knowledge and his knowledge, there is nothing in common, as there is nothing in common between our essence and his essence. With regard to this point, only the equivocality of the term knowledge occasions the error. The fact that we're using the term knowledge, but we're using the same word to describe two different things, God's knowledge and our knowledge, they're not the same thing. We're just using the same term, so it confuses us. We keep on thinking, oh, so God must have known that I was going to get, God forbid, I was going to be stuck in a certain terrible tragedy. So he's the one that made sure that, I missed the bus, or, stories, things like that, right? Or God must have known. But you're imputing your own type of knowledge onto God, and they're two totally different things. Okay, so therefore there's a community only in the terms, right? They're only similar in the fact that we're using the same word, right? Whereas in the true reality of things, there is a difference. It is from this that incongruities follow necessarily. So this is why we keep on making mistakes. And we think, well, if God knew, and then fill in the blanks, then it should be fill in the blanks. You just made a giant mistake. Because when you said if God knew, you're making assumptions based on what you think knowledge means. God's knowledge is something else. And what God's knowledge makes necessary is something completely different. As we imagine that things that obligatorily pertain to our knowledge pertain also to his knowledge. So he laid down this principle, and this is going to be a guiding principle for the rest of this chapter. Although I'm kind of running out of time. But so let's say, I think this is a good stopping point. So if we stop here, next time, Blinetta and Mitchum, next week, we'll pick up from the second paragraph on page 482. Remember, he just laid down the very important principle. So we did several important things today. First of all, the fact that what led people, we did in chapter 19, what led people to assume that God doesn't know what's going on, even though he does, right? Because they concluded from the fact that things aren't what they think they should be, so therefore God must not know, right? And then he laid down this, he brought out this philosophical principle that's very important to realize, that God's knowledge is a completely different thing than our knowledge, and that our assumptions, that when we say that because he knows something else should be, we're starting with a very incorrect premise because his knowledge is different than ours. All right. So we have a couple minutes for questions, comments, so on. Opening the floor.
Is there any record that Rambam actually changed the minds of any of these philosophers? Did any of them?
I don't know. He didn't. I'm sure some of them learned, like when he talked about those guys that made a mistake about King David. I wouldn't be surprised. He mentioned them as being Torah scholars, right? And from our community, he said physicians. I'm sure some of them must have learned from him. I mean, he had students. We know of many of the students, so some people learned from him.
Oh yeah, but I mean, most of his students were about his Torah teachings, right? I mean, not about this, about this philosophical.
I mean, the Rambam didn't really differentiate between the two. They were both. Well, he did Ma'aser Merkava and Ma'aser Bereishis, but he taught them both. I don't know if there's a record of him having a debate with somebody and then having convinced him onto their side. There may be such a story. I just don't know anything offhand. Anything else? All right. Well, if not, then we'll call it a close for tonight. I'll see everybody next week, and we'll have a wonderful, wonderful evening. All right. Be well. Take care.
Yeshua.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you.
Awesome.